Come on, Caleb. Don't you like what you see?
What are you doing?
Caleb, you know Eliana doesn't appreciate you the way she used to.
Please stop. I don't like this.
I'm giving you a chance to stop pretending you're happy.
You're my wife's mother. Step away from me.
And if Eliana walked in right now, what do you think she would believe?
Don't come any closer.
Maybe she should finally see who you really are.
The night Caleb Hart discovered what his mother-in-law had been trying to do, he did not discover it through a confession, a text message, or a suspicious phone call. He discovered it because of a camera she never knew existed. For weeks, Marjorie Whitmore had been quietly creating situations designed to make Caleb's wife believe that her own husband was unfaithful. She wanted her daughter's marriage to collapse, and she was willing to destroy Caleb's reputation to make it happen. But Marjorie made one mistake. She assumed Caleb was too trusting to notice the pattern. She assumed her daughter would always believe her, and most importantly, she assumed nobody was watching. What she never knew was that Caleb had placed a small camera inside his home after noticing things that made no sense. By the time the recording was discovered, his marriage was already hanging by a thread, but the footage would reveal something so disturbing that it would force an entire family to question how well they really knew the woman who had raised them. Caleb Hart was 34 years old when he married Eliana Whitmore. He was not wealthy, famous, or particularly interested in living a glamorous life. He worked as a financial analyst for a private investment company in Charlotte, North Carolina, and had built his life around stability. He liked quiet mornings, organized plans, and the simple comfort of knowing where he stood with the people he loved. Eliana was different. She was more spontaneous, deeply emotional, and fiercely loyal to the people she considered family. Their differences had initially attracted them to each other. Caleb admired her warmth, while Eliana admired the calmness he brought into situations that usually overwhelmed her. For nearly 3 years, their marriage had been peaceful. They had disagreements like every couple, but they had never experienced anything serious enough to make either of them question the future. That changed shortly after Marjorie Whitmore began staying with them more frequently. Marjorie was 61, elegant, confident, and extremely intelligent. She had spent decades learning how to read people, and she was very good at making others feel as though she understood them better than they understood themselves. After her divorce from Eliana's father, she became increasingly dependent on her daughter emotionally. Eliana had always felt responsible for her mother's happiness, especially because Marjorie had repeatedly reminded her how difficult life had been after the divorce. Caleb noticed that Eliana often changed her plans to accommodate her mother. At first, he never complained. He understood that family mattered to his wife. But slowly, something changed. Marjorie stopped behaving like a visiting mother and began behaving like someone who believed she had a permanent place inside her daughter's marriage. Before the story takes another turn, tell us the city you're watching from in the comments. We love connecting with viewers from every corner of the world. And if you enjoy emotional stories that stay with you long after they're over, subscribe now. You won't want to miss what's coming next. She started arriving without warning. She would reorganize parts of the kitchen, criticize the meals Caleb prepared, and make subtle comments about the way he handled money. She questioned why Eliana worked so many hours, and why Caleb sometimes traveled for business. None of these things seemed serious individually. That was what made them difficult to confront. There was never one dramatic incident that Caleb could point to and say that something was wrong. Instead, there were dozens of small moments that left him uncomfortable. Marjorie would watch him when she thought he was not paying attention. She would ask personal questions about his marriage that seemed too intimate for a mother-in-law to ask. She became particularly interested in whether he and Eliana were having problems. Caleb initially assumed she was simply protective of her daughter. He even tried to appreciate it. But then the questions became more specific. Marjorie wanted to know when Eliana was working late, when Caleb traveled, and whether they were sleeping in the same room after an argument. She seemed strangely interested in every weakness inside their marriage. Caleb noticed that whenever he and Eliana had a disagreement, Marjorie somehow learned about it almost immediately. Then, within days, Eliana would begin questioning Caleb about something he had never told anyone. At first, Caleb thought Eliana was simply anxious. Later, he realized that many of her fears had originated from information Marjorie had given her. The first major warning came on a Thursday evening in early November. Caleb had returned home from work earlier than expected because a meeting had been canceled. Eliana was still at her office, and Marjorie was alone in the house. Caleb walked into the kitchen and found her preparing coffee. Nothing about the scene looked unusual, but Marjorie seemed unusually pleased to see him. She had changed from the clothes she normally wore during the day and was dressed in a way Caleb considered inappropriate for the situation. He tried to ignore it. He went to his study, finished some work, and expected the evening to continue normally. Instead, Marjorie began finding reasons to enter the room repeatedly. She asked about his marriage. She asked whether he was happy. She asked whether Eliana still made him feel loved. Then she began asking questions that crossed a boundary Caleb could not ignore. He left the room without giving her the reaction she seemed to expect. That should have been the end of it. Instead, the situation became stranger over the following weeks. Marjorie began creating circumstances where she could be alone with Caleb. Whenever Eliana went shopping, attended an event, or stayed late at work, Marjorie suddenly needed something from Caleb. Sometimes it was help carrying a box. Sometimes it was assistance with her phone. Sometimes she simply wanted company. Caleb began recognizing a pattern. These were not random opportunities. They were carefully timed moments. He never told Eliana immediately because he feared she would misunderstand. That fear became his greatest weakness. Caleb knew how much Eliana loved her mother, and he could not imagine telling his wife that the woman she trusted most was behaving inappropriately toward him. He worried that Eliana would think he was trying to create conflict between them. So Caleb kept the incidents to himself. He thought the behavior would eventually stop. Instead, Marjorie became bolder. Then came the first accusation. One morning, Eliana confronted Caleb about a message she had supposedly seen on his phone. The message appeared to suggest that Caleb had been secretly communicating with another woman. Caleb immediately knew it was false. He had never sent it, but Eliana had already seen the message, and her emotional reaction was intense. She questioned him repeatedly. Caleb showed her his phone and explained everything he could. The message had disappeared from the conversation, leaving no obvious evidence of where it came from. Eliana eventually accepted his explanation, but something inside her had changed. Caleb began wondering whether the strange incidents involving Marjorie and the suspicious message were connected. He checked his accounts. Nothing appeared compromised. He changed his passwords. He reviewed his phone settings. Still, nothing explained what had happened. Then he remembered something from his workplace. His company had recently experienced an internal security issue, and Caleb had learned how inexpensive small home security cameras had become. He decided to install several cameras around his house, not because he wanted to spy on anyone, but because he wanted to understand whether someone had been entering his private space when he was away. One camera was placed in the hallway, another covered the entrance to his study, a third faced the main living area. Caleb did not tell Marjorie about them. He told himself he was simply protecting his home. He had no idea that the recordings would soon protect his marriage. For the next several days, Caleb tried to behave normally. He went to work, came home, spent time with Eliana, and avoided unnecessary conflict with Marjorie. But the atmosphere inside the house had changed. Eliana had become more suspicious. She began checking Caleb's phone more frequently. She asked questions about his schedule that she had never asked before. She seemed to be searching for something, although she could not explain exactly what she was looking for. Caleb recognized the fear in her eyes because he had seen it before. It was the fear of someone who believed they might be losing the person they loved. What Caleb did not know was that someone was deliberately feeding that fear. Marjorie began telling Eliana small stories about Caleb that sounded harmless but were designed to create doubt. She mentioned women she had supposedly seen Caleb speaking with. She questioned why he dressed differently for certain work events. She pointed out how often he checked his phone. She reminded Eliana that successful marriages could become fragile when husbands traveled frequently. None of these statements contained a direct accusation. Instead, they created questions, and questions, when repeated often enough, can become beliefs. Eliana started changing. She became quieter around Caleb. She stopped making plans for the future. She spent more time with her mother and less time with her husband. Caleb tried to reach her emotionally, but every attempt seemed to make things worse. If he asked whether something was wrong, Eliana assumed he was trying to discover what she knew. If he gave her extra attention, she wondered whether he was compensating for something. If he became frustrated, she interpreted it as guilt. Caleb realized he was trapped in a situation where even innocence could look suspicious. Then Marjorie made her most dangerous move. One afternoon, Eliana told Caleb she needed to attend an emergency meeting at work. Marjorie remained at the house because she claimed she was not feeling well. Caleb finished work early and returned home. He expected to find Marjorie resting. Instead, she was waiting for him. The encounter that followed became the most important recording in Caleb's entire life. Marjorie approached him with an unusual confidence. She had clearly prepared herself for the moment. She positioned herself close to Caleb, began making personal remarks, and attempted to convince him that his marriage was already failing. She suggested that Eliana no longer appreciated him. She implied that Caleb deserved someone who understood him better. Then she began making advances toward him that no mother-in-law should ever make toward her daughter's husband. Caleb froze. For several seconds, he could not believe what was happening. This was not an innocent misunderstanding. This was not a badly chosen joke. Marjorie was deliberately crossing a boundary. And Caleb finally understood something that had frightened him for weeks. She was not trying to get him. She was trying to make it look like he wanted her. Marjorie knew that if Eliana walked into the room at the wrong moment, the situation could appear completely different. She could create a photograph, a recording, or even simply a memory that would convince Eliana her husband had betrayed her. Caleb realized that this was probably the explanation behind the accusations, the suspicious message, and the increasing tension between him and his wife. He immediately stepped away from Marjorie and left the room, but he did not confront her. He did not shout. He did not tell Eliana yet. Instead, he went directly to his computer and reviewed the security footage. What he saw made his stomach drop. The camera had recorded everything. It showed Marjorie waiting for Caleb. It showed the way she repeatedly attempted to move closer to him. It showed Caleb stepping away. It showed his attempts to end the situation. And most importantly, it showed that he had never encouraged her behavior. But the footage contained something even more important. Marjorie had entered the house earlier that day and spent several minutes in Caleb's study. She had not been looking for anything obvious. She had been looking through his belongings. Caleb watched the footage several times. He noticed that Marjorie had picked up his phone while he was outside. She appeared to examine it briefly before placing it back exactly where she had found it. That explained how the suspicious message might have been created. But Caleb still needed proof. He continued reviewing older footage. That was when the story became much larger than he had imagined. The recording showed Marjorie entering his study on multiple occasions. She had searched through drawers, handled his phone, and examined documents. On one occasion, she had stood outside the bedroom while Caleb and Eliana were asleep. On another, she had taken a photograph of Caleb speaking with a female colleague through the front window. The image itself was innocent, but Caleb understood what Marjorie could do with it. She could send it to Eliana without context. She could make an ordinary moment look like evidence of betrayal, and she had apparently been doing exactly that. Caleb felt betrayed in a way he had never experienced before. He had treated Marjorie with respect because she was Eliana's mother. He had defended her when Eliana complained about family tension. He had even helped her financially on several occasions. Yet she had been collecting pieces of his ordinary life and rearranging them into a story that could destroy his marriage. But there was one thing Caleb still did not understand. Why? Why would a mother want to destroy her own daughter's marriage? The answer appeared 2 days later. Caleb discovered an old email on Eliana's laptop that had been forwarded from Marjorie months earlier. The message discussed a property that belonged to Eliana's late grandmother. According to the terms of the estate, Eliana could not access the full value of the property until certain conditions were met. One of those conditions involved maintaining ownership independently from her husband for a specific period. Caleb realized Marjorie had been pressuring Eliana to protect the property. But there was another detail. Marjorie was facing serious financial problems. She had accumulated debts that Eliana did not know about. Creditors had been contacting her. Her retirement savings were far smaller than she had admitted, and she had recently discovered that if Eliana became financially independent through the inheritance, she might stop supporting her mother. Marjorie believed that if she could separate Caleb and Eliana, she could regain control over her daughter. The marriage was not simply an obstacle, It was a threat to her influence. Caleb finally understood the larger plan. Marjorie wanted Eliana alone. She wanted her daughter frightened, dependent, and emotionally attached to her, and Caleb was standing in the way. Caleb spent the next 48 hours doing something he had never imagined he would have to do in his own marriage. He collected evidence. He did not do it because he wanted revenge. He did it because he knew that without proof, the truth might never survive the story Marjorie had already created. He saved every relevant camera recording. He preserved the dates. He documented the suspicious messages. He reviewed his financial records and discovered several small transactions that had been made from an account connected to his household. The amounts were not large, but they were unfamiliar. Caleb traced them back and discovered that Marjorie had used information she had accessed from his study. The more he investigated, the more disturbing the pattern became. Marjorie had not planned this over a few days. She had been working on it for months. She had slowly convinced Eliana that Caleb was becoming distant. She had planted doubts about his work trips. She had suggested that he might be interested in other women. She had encouraged Eliana to question his loyalty, and when suspicion alone was not enough, Marjorie created circumstances that could make Caleb appear guilty. The attempted seduction was the final step. If Caleb had responded, Marjorie could have claimed he had pursued her. If Eliana had walked in, Marjorie could have presented herself as the victim. If Caleb had become angry and touched her during the confrontation, she could have claimed he had behaved aggressively. Every outcome benefited Marjorie, except one, the camera. Caleb knew he needed to tell Eliana, but he was terrified of what would happen when she saw the footage. Not because he doubted the truth, he feared what the truth would do to his wife. Eliana had spent her entire life believing her mother was the person who would protect her. Now Caleb would have to show her that the same person had been manipulating her. He waited until Eliana was home on Sunday evening. She walked through the front door carrying a small grocery bag. She looked exhausted. Caleb could see that she had been crying earlier. The marriage they had built together felt fragile enough to break from one more misunderstanding. Caleb did not begin by accusing Marjorie. He did not tell Eliana what he believed. He showed her the footage. The first recording showed Marjorie entering the study. The second showed her examining Caleb's phone. The third showed her photographing him through the window. Then came the recording from the day she attempted to seduce him. Eliana watched in silence. At first she looked confused, then shocked, then completely devastated. The footage removed every possibility of interpretation. There was no hidden angle, no missing context, no misleading photograph. Caleb had stepped away repeatedly. He had attempted to leave the room. He had never encouraged Marjorie. Eliana covered her face as she watched. For the first time, she understood why Caleb had seemed frightened rather than guilty during their recent arguments. She understood why he had been asking strange questions about the messages. She understood why he had started installing cameras. And then she understood something even more painful. Her mother had been using her trust against her. Eliana spent the entire night reviewing the recordings. Each discovery destroyed another piece of the story she had believed. She found messages from Marjorie that had been deliberately written to make her suspicious. She found photographs taken without Caleb's knowledge. She found evidence that Marjorie had accessed private information she had no right to see. She found financial records suggesting that her mother had been hiding the extent of her debts. But the most painful discovery came near the end. There was a recording of Marjorie speaking to herself while alone in the kitchen. She believed no one was listening. In that recording, she described Eliana as someone who could not survive without her. She talked about Caleb as the reason her daughter was becoming independent. She discussed how the marriage had changed Eliana. She explained that as long as Caleb remained in her daughter's life, Eliana would continue making decisions for herself. That was the moment Eliana broke down, because the truth was no longer about money. It was about control. Her mother had not been protecting her. Her mother had been trying to keep her dependent. The next morning, Eliana confronted Marjorie. Caleb did not participate. He stayed away because he understood that this conversation belonged to mother and daughter. Marjorie initially denied everything. Then she changed her explanation. Then she blamed Caleb. Then she claimed she had only been testing him. But the recordings left no room for those explanations. Eliana played the footage, one recording after another. Marjorie watched herself searching through Caleb's belongings. She watched herself create opportunities to be alone with him. She watched herself manipulate information, and eventually, she realized that the story she had carefully constructed had collapsed under the weight of her own actions. Eliana asked her mother why she had done it. Marjorie finally admitted the truth. She was afraid of becoming irrelevant, afraid of losing financial support, afraid that her daughter would build a life where she was no longer the center of everything. And instead of confronting those fears honestly, she chose to destroy the person she believed stood between herself and her daughter. But Marjorie had misunderstood something fundamental. Love does not require control, and family does not give anyone permission to destroy another person's peace. The aftermath was not easy. Knowing the truth did not instantly repair Caleb and Eliana's marriage. In some ways, the truth created a new set of wounds. Eliana had to process the fact that she had doubted her husband because of information supplied by the person she trusted most. Caleb had to process the fact that he had nearly lost his marriage while trying to protect his wife from emotional pain. For several weeks, they lived cautiously. They attended counseling together. They rebuilt communication from the beginning. Caleb learned that keeping painful information to himself, even with good intentions, could create its own kind of distance. Eliana learned that loving her mother did not mean automatically believing everything her mother said. Their marriage slowly became stronger, but it was different. There were new boundaries. Marjorie was no longer allowed unrestricted access to their home. She could not enter their private rooms. She could not handle their phones. She could not interfere with their finances. And most importantly, Eliana stopped allowing guilt to determine her decisions. For the first time in her adult life, she began separating love from obligation. Marjorie eventually moved to another state. The financial problems she had hidden became public within the family, and several relatives helped her arrange a repayment plan. But Caleb and Eliana refused to become responsible for fixing every consequence of her decisions. That was one of the hardest choices Eliana had ever made. She still loved her mother, but she finally understood that love without boundaries can become a prison. Months passed. The house became peaceful again. The cameras that had once represented fear became unnecessary. Caleb eventually removed them. He no longer felt the need to document every moment of his life. The marriage had survived, not because the betrayal had been small, not because the truth had been easy to accept, but because when the truth finally appeared, Caleb and Eliana chose to face it together. A year after the incident, Eliana found an old photograph from the beginning of her marriage. It showed her standing beside Caleb on their wedding day. She remembered how certain she had been that family would always protect them. Now she understood something different. Marriage does not survive because nobody outside the relationship can hurt it. Marriage survives when two people are willing to protect the truth between them. Caleb had once believed the hardest part of the experience was discovering that his mother-in-law had tried to seduce him. Years later, he realized that was not the deepest wound. The deepest wound was discovering how easily a carefully planted lie could make two people who loved each other question everything they knew. The secret camera had captured more than an inappropriate encounter. It had captured the moment manipulation was exposed. It had captured evidence that saved Caleb from an accusation he could never have disproved with words alone. But perhaps its greatest purpose was something neither Caleb nor Eliana expected. It forced the truth into the open before resentment could permanently destroy their marriage. Marjorie had believed she was removing Caleb from her daughter's life. Instead, her actions forced Eliana to become independent from her. She had believed that destroying the marriage would bring her daughter closer. Instead, it taught her daughter where loyalty had to begin, and she had believed Caleb would be easy to manipulate. Instead, his decision to remain calm, preserve the evidence, and refuse to retaliate gave him the one thing Marjorie could never control: the truth. Today, Caleb and Eliana still live in the same home where the entire ordeal began. They have rebuilt their marriage slowly and deliberately. They travel together more often. They communicate more openly. And they no longer allow other people, even family members, to become the third person inside their marriage. As for Marjorie, she remains part of Eliana's life, but from a distance and under boundaries that did not exist before. The relationship between mother and daughter was never completely restored to what it had been. Perhaps that was impossible. Some forms of trust, once broken, do not return in their original shape. But Eliana eventually reached a place where she could see her mother without allowing her mother to control her. And Caleb learned something that changed the way he viewed loyalty forever. Sometimes protecting a marriage does not mean fighting louder. It means staying calm when someone is trying to provoke you. It means refusing to become the person someone else is trying to portray. It means keeping your integrity even when nobody appears to believe you. And sometimes, the truth needs evidence. Because when someone is determined to rewrite reality, words can become a battlefield, but evidence has no feelings. It does not become nervous. It does not change its story. It simply shows what happened. That small camera had been installed because Caleb was afraid something was wrong inside his home. He never imagined that it would eventually become the reason his wife discovered the truth. He never imagined that the person he needed protection from was someone he had welcomed into his home, and he certainly never imagined that the greatest threat to his marriage would not come from another woman, another man, or some distant stranger. It would come from someone sitting at their dinner table. Someone calling herself family, someone who believed she could destroy a marriage simply by controlling what one person believed about another. But in the end, Marjorie lost the one thing she had been trying hardest to control, her daughter's dependence. And Caleb and Eliana gained something they had never fully understood before: the freedom to choose each other without anyone standing between them. Because sometimes the most dangerous lies are not the ones shouted in public. They are the quiet ones whispered to the people we love. And sometimes, the person trying hardest to separate two people discovers too late that the truth has been watching all along. And now I want to hear from you. If you were in Caleb's position, would you have shown Eliana the recordings immediately, or would you have kept the evidence to yourself until you knew exactly what Marjorie was planning? Tell me what you would have done in the comments. And if this story reminded you that sometimes the people closest to us can hide the deepest intentions, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because there are more emotional stories, shocking betrayals, and unexpected truths waiting for you. Until the next story, remember, the truth may take time to reveal itself, but it always leaves evidence behind.